Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Retro gaming and retro computing are both really popular, but it makes one wonder, is the driving force behind those movements really just older people wanting to relive their youth? So a couple episodes back, I did a Q&A, and I got a whole ton of really good questions. Generally, they elicited fairly short responses. But there was one question that I got that I felt was really good and deserving of a longer response, so I saved it for now. We're going to turn it into its own podcast episode. Viewer Rob writes, "Hey Colin, given the spike in retro gaming in recent years and the general fact that a lot of gamers actively use older hardware than the industry produces games for, do you think there's something to the idea of older hardware having a special kind of relevance outside of nostalgia? We're increasingly seeing homebrew and one-off productions of physical media for old consoles that are supposedly obsolete. There are even people keeping Dreamcasts and original Xboxes online in very niche communities. It strikes me that older hardware may have been superseded, but could also be fertile ground for its own kind of market. After all, we see stuff in the audio market hanging around for decades, so why not gaming and computing hardware?" Some very astute observations there, and the answer to all of those questions ultimately, I think, comes down simply to it depends on who you ask. It's a complicated answer, and it's going to be a different answer based on the motivations behind every individual who's involved in retro gaming and retro computing. I don't think there is one overall main reason why those movements are the size that they are. I think, yes, certainly there are a number of people who are maybe in their middle years, older, who simply are in it for the nostalgia. They remember having a video game console when they were young, and maybe they don't have it anymore. They lost it, they sold it, they got rid of it, they grew tired of it, and now they're feeling like they want to reminisce again. They miss it. They want to give it another shot. Or the other common example, kind of similar along those lines, is maybe there was a game console that they never had when they were younger. Now that they're older, they're an adult, they've got a little bit of disposable income and a bit of free time on their hands. They decide, you know what, let's give it a shot. And they actually go out and pick up one of those consoles and all the accessories to kind of catch up on what they were missing. That said, I also think there are a decent number of younger people who are getting into it. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with them too. Now, I think a lot of them are getting into it simply because they want to learn or experience what those older consoles, those older computer systems were like. It's very different now versus what they were back then. It's kind of like, you could say it's the same thing as, watching old TV shows and movies now, but the games and the consoles really seem to hold up better over time, right? You watch an old TV show from, say, the 60s or 70s, and you would ask a young person what they thought of it, and they'd say, oh, it's just full of dad jokes, or they didn't get it, or whatever. But you put a game from, say, the 80s in front of that same person, and they might find it fun and interesting. That just the technology still somehow seems to be a bit more relevant. But at the same time, it also offers some really interesting challenges. So especially in the realm of retro computing, the technology now is so simple, so straightforward, so easy to use. It's really just plug and play, right? You buy a part for your computer, you plug it in, you're done, it works, you're good to go. But back then, it was a lot more challenging. There was a lot more configuration, a lot more hands-on work that had to go into it. You had to figure out how to make that part work. Not everything was just hand-holding you through the process. So there's also a really compelling opportunity to learn. about all this older technology. And I think that's appealing to younger folks because in some ways, modern technology is kind of boring. I mean, it's exciting in what it can do, but there's not so much kind of wonder and mystique behind it. It's just, okay, we expect technology to move on. We expect these amazing things to keep coming out, and because it's continually delivered more and more amazing things. You look at the graphics capabilities of the current gen game consoles or a computer with a modern video card, and in context, you know, at a snapshot in time, it's absolutely amazing. But because we're living through it and we've come to expect this rapid progression of technology, it gets a little bit boring. But the retro stuff, if you keep in mind all that context, it's really exciting because that was bleeding edge in an era where you didn't know what bleeding edge was going to be. You didn't know what was going to come up next or how fast it was going to come out. So there is a bit of a difference, I think, between the younger folks who never lived through it when it was new and are just getting into some of the retro stuff now, and the older folks who did live through it, who were around when that stuff was brand new. And the big difference between the two, I think, kind of is nostalgia, but not nostalgia as in fondly remembering it, but more along the lines of understanding the overall context in which that item came out. So here's a great example. You look at something, again, like video games, and we've expected these massive improvements in gaming. We kind of know where it's going to go from here. Back in, say, the 80s and 90s, yeah, there was still relatively rapid progression of technology, but there were things that we couldn't even wrap our heads around at the time. It was just so bleeding edge, so fresh. We weren't used to seeing such rapid progression that when new tech came out, it really had an emotional impact on us. So for me, one main piece of technology, and especially within the realm of gaming, that means a lot to me from that emotional side is the Nintendo 64. A lot of people say, oh, the N64 sucked, whatever. But if you take it in context, if you think about the era in which the N64 came out, it was absolutely amazing. You go from games that were relatively flat. There weren't very many 3D kind of based games. A lot of them were simple scrollers at the time. And then you give someone this much better looking, but fully three-dimensional console where it's not just scrolling, left to right or, shoot 'em ups where it's, you're flying upwards towards the screen all the time. I mean, Star Fox had a little bit of it, but it still felt kind of flat. You go from, say, Super Mario World to Mario 64, and it was just mind-blowing. The fact that it was an open world map and you could see 360 degrees and just go wherever you wanted and have all these controls and have this sense of depth. It, in its era, was a really, really big deal. And that's the one disconnect, I think, that there is between younger people getting into this retro technology for the first time and folks who were around when it was brand new. Is the people who were around have that sense of wonder. They remember how that technology made them feel. They remember what else was going on at the time and why that piece of tech was so groundbreaking. Or if it wasn't groundbreaking, why it flopped, why it was no big deal after all, why nobody cared about it, why it was weird or unusual for its era, whereas now we may just think of it as this other old piece of junk or whatever. So that's something that I think is really interesting between the two sides, and it can actually serve as a bit of a bridge where you can have older generations, older folks, and I don't want to say old people because I don't want to call myself old because I don't feel like I'm old yet. All right, I'm not going to lie to you. I feel old. Anyway, so it's a bridge between people who lived through it and people who didn't. And hopefully that knowledge can get passed down between the two so that the younger folks getting into this stuff can actually understand and conceptualize the deeper meaning behind all that tech, and not just, well, Super Mario World was, this 16-bit side scroller, and yeah, it's got these characters that we meet for the first time and they ended up being pretty important to the franchise, that kind of thing. But why was that console a big deal? Why did it cement itself as being a pretty big part of video gaming history? Hopefully that knowledge can get passed down. But there's also a couple other parts to this whole thing that I think keep getting more people into it. And it's that a lot of this old retro tech can just be fresh for people, right? Not even beyond just the whole historical interest. I want to see what it was like back then kind of angle, but just the fact that it's new. People love stuff that's novel. So going back to older consoles, if you're bored with the current generation, if you've played everything that you're interested in playing on your PS4 or your Xbox One, but you still crave some kind of new gaming experience, going back to an older console you've never played is just flat out interesting. And I think that's also where we've started to see, like in that question I was asked, this cottage industry kind of develop around all of these different parts and pieces and accessories and stuff that have been coming out for these consoles that are decades old. I mean, we're all familiar with the mod parts for things like the Game Boys and other Nintendo consoles, backlit screens, replacement shells, that kind of stuff. And that's been around for a long time. But we've started to see new games be written for these old consoles. And to extend that even further, we're starting to see new hardware get developed for these old consoles. And beyond just simple cosmetic mods, I mean, people want to be able to play these old systems on their new modern televisions, for example. So it's not as simple as, well, you want to play these old games, just go ahead and, buy them on the virtual console on your modern, on a modern system. Instead, we're seeing people developing actual hardware solutions so you can still keep that overall physical setup, the kind of snapshot in time feeling of what it was like to play on an original controller with an original system and an original cartridge or original CD, but get the best video quality you can on your modern television. So we've been seeing like HDMI mod boards and adapters, that sort of stuff. It takes a lot of engineering time and understanding in order to put that stuff together. And from the hardware perspective, that's really cool because it means people are actually going back and learning deep how this stuff worked. And hopefully it gives them a better concept of just how far technology has changed. And then the other side to that is also software. So as much as we've been seeing brand new games getting written, we've also seen a ton of ROM hacks. And ROM hacks lately for me have been really, really interesting, especially around the Super Mario World community. There have been a ton of ROM hacks written for specifically that game, trying to push it in all sorts of crazy new directions. And it's really heartening to see because not only does it show that people are still interested in that older game, that older platform, but also that they're willing to learn how it works. It's showing that people are spending the time reverse engineering these games to actually get deep down into the code and see just how much could be done with relatively limited resources. I mean, if there are tons of documents and tutorials and other information out there on the internet, far too many for me to, kind of boil down into a nutshell for you, but there have been people who have analyzed just the code of games and found just all the clever stuff that the original programmers did to try and get as much game as they could into, say, the limited capacity of a flash chip on a cartridge, or the limited amount of RAM that a console may have had. So it's really cool to see that we've got people who are not only getting interested in that code, but are willing to extend it. They're willing to modify it. And it's not just on that kind of technical level of being able to go in and write their own game and manage to get it to fit still within the constraints of the platform, but also there's the creativity angle to it. They're able to take these games and push them in new directions and exploit quirks about the way the game works as part of the gameplay, taking advantage of, say, some weirdness about how an enemy operates or an object operates, and use that to their advantage in the game. So I strongly recommend, if you're curious about any of this stuff, just go watch some of the Let's Plays on these ROM hacks. I've talked about them before, but one of my favorite Let's Players is Ryukar here on YouTube. And he's done several of these ROM hack playthroughs, and some of them are just grueling how difficult they are. But it's so rewarding in the end to see just what can get done to beat these levels, just how precise you need to be, yet people can still manage to pull it off. And this was all written and designed generally by like one person who would go through and come up with their own idea for a game based on an existing framework. So I love that we're seeing this whole new market for stuff, because it means that we're going beyond just buying the old parts on eBay and playing them for a while and then getting bored with them again. It means that there's some staying power to it, that people are willing to treat these consoles not just as a snapshot in time. They're totally relevant as a snapshot in time, and I hope that's something that never gets lost on people, but also as fully living new modern systems in their own right, just maybe not as technologically advanced as the latest and greatest stuff that we have available to us. So it's moved, I think, from being a generational thing. You started with the NES, and then that got replaced by the Super NES, and that got replaced by the N64, and repeat for the same thing on the Sega side and the Sony side, the Microsoft side. And then the same thing with computer hardware, where just, these new generations of parts and components keep coming out and making the old stuff obsolete. I think we're moving past it being a point in time where we're always just moving the bar forward and forgetting about the past. I think we're finally starting to think of all of this stuff kind of as a whole. And yeah, there's definitely stuff you can do with newer consoles and newer systems that you can never do with the older stuff, but that doesn't make the older stuff any less relevant or any less fun or any less worthy of exploration. So altogether, it's kind of changed in some ways the way we think of technology. The march of progress will continue, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the stuff that came before is suddenly completely irrelevant. So it'll be interesting to see where things go from here, whether we're going to continue that kind of mentality, whether it'll pick up any more steam. I mean, who knows what future generations could do with this kind of stuff. In some ways, it'd be really curious to see what the state of, say, the Super NES is in like 30 years. Will people continue to do the same things with it then like they are now? Or will it kind of fade into obscurity again for a while? I mean, granted, we're seeing what we're seeing with retro technology in a bit of a bubble where we've only been familiar with it in its current state, with all the ROM hacks and the additional custom hardware and all that for the past few years. Maybe it'll stick around like that. Maybe this is just something that's going to stay, but maybe it'll fade out in a few more years. Maybe some new technology will come out that's just mind-blowing, that we've never even been able to conceptualize until when it came out. And it'll capture everybody's attention, and it'll kind of be like the 80s and 90s again. And maybe we'll just go back into we're so interested in this latest and greatest, this newest stuff at the time that, forget about the older stuff for a while. That's suddenly not as interesting. Maybe we'll go that direction. I'm really curious to find out. But in any event, I'm simply going to enjoy what we've been seeing now with modern takes on older stuff and people just getting into it again. Because knowledge is fun and knowledge is power, and it gives you that context, that overall sense of what things have been like over time when you may not have even been there to live through it, if that makes any sense. So I guess the waffle is kind of over, but ultimately I'm just really excited for not just where we've been and where we are, but where we're going, and hopefully even more cool stuff is just around the corner. I am, of course, curious as to your thoughts. Have you been in the retro community for a while, or are you relatively new to it? Did you live through any of those eras and are getting back into it now, or is some of the stuff that you're getting into totally new to you and you've got no idea what life was like when that system or part or console was first released? Also, are you into retro computing or retro video gaming? Both of them seem to have some parallels, but also some really interesting differences. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts, so be sure to leave them down in the comments below. If you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, they are available for Patreon supporters at all contribution levels. As little as $1 a month gets you access. They usually go up a few days before they're available on YouTube, and Patreon does support RSS support. So if you're curious or interested, just something to keep in mind. Anyway, if you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.